Rome was starving. Grain ships were disappearing. Merchants were refusing to sail. Pirate squadrons had reached the Italian coast. And then in 67 BC, the Roman people gave one-man power over almost the entire Mediterranean. By the time Pompey reached Cilicia, the campaign was already almost over. The Mediterranean had been divided into 13 districts. Ships were stationed at choke points, lanes, harbors, and escape routes. Commanders were told where to stay. The point was not to chase every raider across the sea. The point was to make escape vanish. This is the case the episode is built around. The Roman anti-piracy campaign of 67 BC passed under the Lex Gabinia and remembered because Plutarch says the sea was cleared in less than 3 months. The central question is not whether Pompey was energetic. The record says he was. The question is why this campaign worked when earlier Roman campaigns had not. Visual reconstructions are AI-assisted and based on historical records. Start with the map. In the 1st century BC, the Mediterranean was not one empty blue space. It was a set of lanes. Grain from Sicily and Africa moved toward Italy. Merchants crossed from the Aegean to Asia Minor. Ships hugged islands, capes, harbors, and predictable winds. A raider did not need to control the whole sea. He needed to know where traffic had to pass. The sources call the raiders Cilician, but that word can mislead. Cilicia was a real region on the southern coast of Asia Minor. It also became a Roman shorthand for a wider maritime problem that reached through Pamphylia, Lycia, Crete, the Aegean, and the approaches to Italy. The label compresses many crews, ports, patrons, and war economies into one name. Plutarch gives the Roman memory of the crisis in hard strokes. He says the pirates had first been based in Cilicia, then gained confidence during the wars of Mithridates, while Rome was distracted by civil conflict. They no longer attacked only ships. They struck islands and maritime cities. He gives large numbers, more than 1,000 pirate vessels, 400 cities captured, and sanctuaries raided across the Greek world. Those figures should be handled carefully. Plutarch wrote long after the campaign, and Roman writers had reasons to make the enemy large enough to justify an extraordinary command. But the political effect of the fear is not in doubt. By 67 BC, Romans believed the sea had become unsafe enough that ordinary authority had failed. In the city, a grain shortage was politics. Bread queues moved faster than speeches. Plutarch says provisions were hard to get and scarcity was expected. Cicero, speaking 1 year later in support of Pompey's next command, reminded his audience that the Roman people had already chosen Pompey for the pirate war against senatorial resistance. The campaign began as a legal decision before it became a military one. Aulus Gabinius, a tribune of the plebs and an ally of Pompey, proposed the law. Plutarch describes it in language that still feels startled. The command was not simply a naval command. It gave Pompey authority across the sea inside the Pillars of Hercules and over the mainland for 400 furlongs from the coast. In practice, that meant almost every important coastal space in the Roman world fell inside the zone of operations. The first version gave him 15 legates and 200 ships. Then the popular assembly expanded the resources. Plutarch's later count is larger. 500 ships, 120,000 men-at-arms, 5,000 horsemen, 24 senior commanders, and 2 quaestors. Appian gives a different operational count. 270 ships, 120,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 25 senatorial assistants. The disagreement matters. It tells us not to treat the numbers as a clean staff return. Ancient authors were preserving political scale as much as exact logistics. But the shared picture is clear enough. This was not a captain sent after criminals. This was a republic granting one man a theater command across the whole inland sea. The success of that grant would later teach Rome to trust the same kind of authority again, and then comes the detail that makes the campaign different. Pompey divided the Mediterranean into districts. Plutarch says 13. Appian gives the logic. Each commander had a station. Each station had ships, troops, and authority. The commanders were not meant to roam endlessly after a fleeing target. They were meant to hold their parts of the sea, catch raiders driven from neighboring stations, and stop scattered crews from joining together again. Earlier campaigns had struck at places. Pompey's campaign struck at movement. Appian's geography makes the design more concrete. Spain had commanders. The waters near Gaul and Liguria had a commander. Africa, Sardinia, and Corsica were grouped into another assignment. Sicily and the Adriatic had their own watch. The Peloponnese, Attica, Euboea, Thessaly, Macedonia, and Boeotia formed another zone. Lycia, Pamphylia, Cyprus, and Phoenicia sat near the eastern end of the net. The names can blur on first hearing, so hold the shape instead. West, center, islands, Greek coast, Asia Minor, Levant. The Mediterranean was not patrolled from one prow. It was divided into linked rooms, and each room had a guard at the door. That design also changed the psychology of flight. A raiding crew could outrun one ship. It could not outrun a plan that expected it to run. If a raiding squadron fled west, it met a station. If it fled toward the islands, it met another. If it tried to wait out the pressure in an inlet, the surrounding districts kept the pressure from thinning. Appian's point is plain. The system prevented commanders from being dragged away from their own stations and wasting time in circular pursuit. The Romans were not only adding more ships, they were changing the geometry of pursuit. The first sweep moved through the western Mediterranean. Plutarch says Pompey cleared the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Libyan Sea, and the waters around Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily in 40 days. Appian says he inspected the western stations first, then passed through Rome on his return. The sequence matters. The west came first because Rome could not tolerate danger near the grain routes and the Italian coast. A sea lane did not have to be perfectly safe everywhere before the political effect appeared. It had to look controlled where Rome felt most exposed. Plutarch says the price of provisions fell quickly enough that people joked the name of Pompey had already ended the war. That is propaganda, but useful propaganda. It shows what the public thought the campaign was for. The measure of success was not only captured ships, it was food reaching the market. Then Pompey moved east. In a simple adventure version, this is the moment a great commander sails straight to the pirate strongholds and destroys them in battle. The records give a stranger pattern. The campaign's hardest fighting may have been less important than the surrender mechanism that came before it. There was also friction inside the Roman side. Plutarch says the consul Piso interfered with Pompey's equipment and discharged crews. Pompey had to send his fleet around to Brundisium while he returned toward Rome to settle the obstruction. That detail matters because it keeps the campaign from looking automatic. The extraordinary command did not erase rivalry. It gave Pompey enough public force to push through it. Another complication was Crete. Plutarch calls Crete a second source of piracy after Cilicia. Metellus had already been sent there before Pompey received his command, and he was carrying out his own campaign. The new law's coastal reach made conflict almost inevitable. Surviving pirate groups in Crete could appeal to Pompey, and Pompey could claim the island fell inside his authority. Plutarch is not flattering here. He says Pompey tried to stop Metellus's war, told cities to ignore him, and sent Lucius Octavius into the strongholds of the besieged men. Metellus refused to yield, captured the pirates, and punished them anyway. This episode is not about making Pompey cleaner than the sources make him. The same command that made the Mediterranean grid possible also created jurisdictional collision. Success and overreach were not separate stories. They came from the same law. Plutarch says some pirate bands asked for mercy while still roving. Pompey seized their ships and persons, but did not kill them. Once that became known, other crews avoided his subordinate commanders and came to him with wives and children. He spared them too. Their surrender then helped him locate the crews that stayed hidden. That is not softness. It is intelligence work. Pompey used clemency as a tool of separation. Surrendered crews were no longer part of the moving problem. They became information. The holdouts became easier to identify because the sea around them was being emptied. By the time Pompey reached Cilicia, the system had already done much of its work. Appian says Pompey expected difficult fighting against rock-bound citadels. He brought forces and siege equipment because he thought he would need every kind of battle. Instead, the scale of his preparations and the fear attached to his name produced panic. Cragus and Anti-Cragus surrendered. Then other mountain communities in Cilicia surrendered. Then more followed. Appian lists what they gave up: arms, ships afloat, ships still on the stocks. brass, iron, sailcloth, rope, and materials for building more vessels. He also says they released captives held for ransom or chained to labor. That list is more important than the battle image. It shows piracy as infrastructure. There were ships under construction, there were workshops, there were stored materials, there were captives used for profit and labor. A raiding vessel at sea was only the visible end of a shore-based economy. The midpoint of the case is here. Up to this point, the question has been how Rome cleared the sea so quickly. After Appian's inventory, the question changes. What exactly had Rome cleared? Not a few isolated crews. It had cleared a system of harbors, markets, workshops, prisoners, and coastal shelters that had grown inside the gaps left by war. The myth says piracy was a crime wave. The records say something more structural. Plutarch ties its growth to the Mithridatic Wars and Roman civil disorder. Appian describes people who had lost livelihood and country through war, then took to the sea. Modern scholars are even more cautious. Pirate in Greek and Roman writing could be a legal label, an insult, and a political category, not just a neutral job description. This does not make the violence harmless. It makes the cause clearer. Piracy in this case was not outside the war. It was one of the forms the war took after states, clients, ports, and armies had broken the normal routes of survival. Appian says Pompey burned the materials, carried away the ships, and sent the captives home. Plutarch says the main surrender at Cilician and the surrounding fortified places brought the war to an end in less than 3 months. He says Pompey received 90 ships with bronze beaks and faced more than 20,000 men. Then Pompey made the decision that most clearly shows how he understood the problem. He did not execute them all. Plutarch says he thought it would be dangerous to let so many poor, warlike men scatter or regroup. His answer was relocation. Some were settled in small or half-deserted Cilician cities. Some were settled at Soli, restored after destruction connected with Tigranes. Many were sent to Dyme and Achaia, a place with land and too few people. Appian gives a similar account and names Malus, Adana, Epiphania, other thinly peopled towns in rough Cilicia, and Dyme. Modern viewers often expect anti-piracy to mean pursuit, battle, capture, execution. Pompey's settlement policy shows a different calculation. The campaign removed ships from the sea, but it also tried to remove men from the conditions that made returning to sea likely. The policy was not sentimental, it was preventive. The state that could not patrol every inlet forever tried to change where former raiders lived, how they made a living, and which local communities could absorb them. The evidence does not let us measure how well every settlement worked, but the logic is visible in both Plutarch and Appian. Destroy the fleet, break the workshops, return the captives, move the surviving crews inland or into depopulated towns. The speed of the campaign came from that sequence. There is another part of the record that needs a colder reading. The Lex Gabinia was a solution, but it was also a warning about Roman politics. The Senate resisted. Plutarch says many leading senators feared the command because it placed too much power in one man's hands. Cicero, 1 year later, turned the public success of the pirate war into an argument for giving Pompey the command against Mithridates. The pirate campaign became proof that extraordinary power could work. That is the institutional price of success. A normal magistracy had failed to make the sea feel safe. The public then accepted a command so wide that Plutarch compared it to monarchy. Once that command succeeded, the argument for ordinary limits weakened. Cicero did not hide this. He told the people that their judgment in the pirate war had brought safety and honor, and that the great men opposing Pompey's new command should yield to the authority of the Roman people. Cicero's speech is not a neutral report, it is advocacy. He is trying to win another command for the same man. But that is exactly why the speech is useful. It shows how fast the pirate campaign became political capital. The sea campaign had ended. The argument it created had not. Appian makes the connection even sharper. While Pompey was still in Cilicia, Rome chose him for the war against Mithridates and gave him powers to make war and peace and to decide which nations were friends or enemies. Appian says powers of that kind had never before been given to one general. The anti-piracy campaign therefore did more than clear routes. It made a case for a new kind of command. It proved that if a threat could be described as Mediterranean-wide, Rome could answer with Mediterranean-wide authority. Rome solved piracy and accidentally taught itself to trust extraordinary power. The pirate war had two endings. One ending happened on the Cilician coast. Ships were surrendered, materials were burned, captives went home, former raiders were moved into towns. The other ending happened in Roman political memory. A single commander, armed with a vast mandate, had solved in one season what piecemeal commands had failed to solve. The campaign made concentration of power look practical. Pompey's achievement was real. The records give him speed, scale, and a design that understood the sea as connected space. But the campaign also taught Rome a lesson it would keep using. If the problem is large enough, the law can be stretched around one man. The most useful image is still the map. 13 districts, stations held, routes closed, crews separated, strongholds isolated. The map explains the victory better than a battle painting does. The Cilician pirates were not beaten because Pompey personally hunted every vessel in the Mediterranean. They were beaten because the Mediterranean was turned into a grid, and the grid made flight expensive. The case did not begin when Pompey sailed for Cilicia. It began when war made the sea a labor market, a ransom market, and a refuge for armed men the coastal states could not absorb. It ended when Rome stopped treating the problem as a scattered crime and treated it as a system with routes, ports, materials, captives, and escape lanes. That was the power of the districts. And that is why the 3-month campaign still matters. It was not only a famous Roman victory, it was an early lesson in what counter-piracy looks like when the target is movement itself.